What if I told you that the very empire we often celebrate for its roads, its legions, and its marble monuments was also built on corruption, betrayal, and blood? That behind the togas and triumphs, Rome was a place where emperors declared war on the sea, senators plotted murder in broad daylight, and entire arenas cheered as men and women were torn apart for sport. The Rome you think you know, the Rome of glory, was only half the story. The other half, that's the Rome of scandal. When we learn about ancient Rome, the story often feels like a highlight reel. Julius Caesar crossing the Rubicon, Augustus ushering in the Pax Romana, and monumental buildings like the Colosseum still standing 2,000 years later. Rome appears polished, disciplined, almost timeless, but history is rarely that clean. Peel back the marble façade, and you'll find something far darker. This was an empire where politics was a blood sport, where emperors indulged their most dangerous whims, where morality was preached but rarely practiced, and where cruelty itself became a form of entertainment. In today's journey, we're diving headfirst into the scandals they don't teach you in school. The scandals that reveal not only the weaknesses of Rome's leaders, but also the shadows cast by its greatness. We'll explore corruption and betrayal in the Senate, the madness of emperors who ruled like gods, the shocking sexual scandals that shook Roman society, the greed and exploitation that fueled its wealth, and finally, the blood-soaked spectacles that kept the people entertained. So let's set aside the sanitized image of Rome and look instead at its darker, scandalous heart. When most people picture Rome, they imagine gleaming marble temples, senators in white togas debating laws, and emperors commanding legions that stretched across continents. But beneath that polished surface, Roman politics was anything but noble. The Senate, often idealized as the heart of Roman democracy, was in reality a nest of vipers where betrayal, bribery, and assassination were common tools of negotiation. Politics in Rome was not a contest of ideas. It was a game of survival, where fortunes could change in an instant. Take the case of Julius Caesar. His rise to power was as much about cunning alliances and political maneuvering as it was about military brilliance. He aligned himself with Pompey and Crassus in the so-called First Triumvirate, essentially bending the Republic to their will. Yet, when power shifted, that same alliance crumbled, and Rome was plunged into civil war. Senators who toasted Caesar one evening were sharpening their daggers the next. His assassination in 44 BCE was not merely the end of a man, but a vivid reminder that in Rome, loyalty often lasted only as long as it was convenient. But Caesar was not unique. Emperors who followed often had to buy the loyalty of the Praetorian Guard. Rome's elite soldiers, tasked with protecting the emperor, but notorious for selling that protection to the highest bidder. When Caligula's excesses became unbearable, it was the Praetorians who cut him down. Later, in the chaotic Year of the Four Emperors, 69 CE, armies marched on Rome not for ideals, but because their generals had promised them donatives, huge cash rewards in exchange for loyalty. It was a world where the price of power was counted not in votes but in gold, and one's safety depended on who had the sharpest blade or the fattest purse. For the Roman elite, corruption was not shameful. It was expected. Governors of provinces routinely extorted wealth from the lands they ruled, enriching themselves while crushing local populations. Trials for corruption did occur, but they were often political theatre. The accused could buy off their judges or appeal to more powerful patrons. To survive, a senator needed not only ambition, but also the ability to weave a web of favors, secrets, and debts. The ideal of Rome as a bastion of republican virtue crumbled long before the Republic fell. Behind the statues, inscriptions, and noble speeches was a political world driven by greed, fear, and betrayal. If political corruption was Rome's constant undercurrent, The madness of emperors was the storm that periodically broke through, shocking the empire with scandal. Nowhere was the darker side of Rome more visible than in the palaces of its rulers. Emperors were not merely political leaders. They were living gods in the eyes of many Romans, and with such power came temptations that often spiraled into excess and cruelty. Consider Emperor Caligula. He began his reign with promise, charming the Senate and people with gestures of generosity. But soon, his name became synonymous with insanity. Ancient writers accused him of declaring war on the sea, ordering his soldiers to gather seashells as spoils of victory against Neptune. He paraded his horse Incitatus as a priest, and even considered making him a consul. His reign was filled with extravagant feasts, public humiliations of senators, and brutal executions disguised as entertainment. For many Romans, it must have felt as though the empire itself had become hostage to one man's whims. Nero, another infamous figure, left behind a legacy of fire and song. Ancient accounts suggest that during the Great Fire of Rome in 64 CE, Nero played his lyre as the city burned. Though historians debate the accuracy of that image, what is certain is that Nero seized the opportunity to build his Domus Aurea, the Golden House, a sprawling palace dripping in gold leaf, marble, and artificial lakes, a monument not to Rome's greatness but to his own ego. He fancied himself a great performer, forcing senators and citizens alike to sit through his endless poetry and theatrical performances, while executions and purges mounted behind the scenes. Even the so-called good emperors were not free from scandal. Commodus, son of Marcus Aurelius, styled himself as a gladiator, appearing in the arena to fight opponents who dared not raise a real challenge. He renamed Rome after himself, decreeing that all months of the calendar should bear his titles. His reign was marked by paranoia and excess, a chilling reminder of how absolute power could transform even the son of a philosopher into a tyrant. The scandals of imperial madness were not confined to eccentricity. They revealed the fragility of Rome itself, when one man's delusion could dictate the lives of millions. The empire was at the mercy of personalities rather than principles. In many ways, Rome's emperors embodied the best and worst of human nature magnified by unimaginable power, and their excesses were both a spectacle and a warning carved into history. Rome loved to present itself as a society of order, discipline, and virtue. Its laws emphasized morality, its literature praised self-control, and its emperors often tried to cloak their reigns in images of piety and tradition. But behind closed doors, scandalous stories of lust, betrayal, and hypocrisy filled the streets of the empire. The very people who preached morality were often the ones most guilty of breaking it. The private lives of emperors provide the juiciest glimpses into Rome's sexual scandals. Caligula once again takes the stage, accused of sleeping with his sisters and flaunting his incestuous relationships in public. Whether exaggerated or not, the rumors were powerful enough to stain his memory for centuries. Nero married not once, but multiple times, including to a freedman named Pythagoras, with Nero playing the role of bride. Later, he reportedly had a young boy named Sporus castrated so that he could marry him as well, parading him as an empress before the Roman people. These unions were not hidden. They were spectacles of power, acts designed to shock as much as to satisfy. But scandal was not limited to the emperors. Senators and wealthy elites often indulged in excesses that would have horrified the average Roman citizen. Extravagant banquets sometimes turned into orgies, and elite households could be centers of intrigue and seduction. The poet Juvenal sneered at noblewomen who abandoned all pretenses of modesty, attending gladiator schools or engaging in affairs with their slaves. Even Vestal virgins, sworn to chastity under penalty of death, were sometimes caught in scandals that rocked Rome's religious foundations. What made these scandals particularly striking was the hypocrisy surrounding them. Augustus, the first emperor, famously passed laws meant to encourage marriage and punish adultery, yet his own daughter Julia was exiled for her numerous affairs, a public humiliation for the imperial family. Roman society claimed to value marital fidelity, yet the institution of slavery meant that elite men had nearly unlimited access to the bodies of enslaved people, a fact often left unspoken in moralizing speeches. In a city of marble and law, sex was both a private act and a public weapon. Accusations of immorality could be wielded as tools of political destruction, just as easily as daggers. Enemies of emperors often spread rumors of debauchery to undermine their rule, and the line between fact and slander was always blurred. What remains clear, however, is that Rome was never the model of virtue it liked to pretend. Beneath the togas and marble statues lay a society driven by passions as much as by politics, one where scandal was never far from the surface. Rome's grandeur came at a staggering cost, and it was not the emperors or senators who paid it. Behind the shimmering palaces, triumphal arches, and endless games lay a system of exploitation that drained the lifeblood from conquered provinces and common citizens alike. Scandal in Rome was not always about sex or politics. It was often about the sheer scale of greed. The Roman elite lived lives of unimaginable luxury. Banquets could feature flamingo tongues, dormice soaked in honey, and wine imported from the farthest corners of the empire. Emperors like Lucullus and Vitellius became infamous for their feasting, with tables groaning under the weight of exotic dishes, while the poor of Rome relied on state distributed grain to survive. Vitellius, in fact, was said to eat 4 meals a day, each a spectacle of gluttony, while soldiers and peasants starved under the weight of endless taxes. The burden of Rome's splendor fell on the provinces. Governors sent to rule regions like Gaul, Asia, or Africa often treated them as personal estates to be plundered. They imposed crushing taxes, seized lands, and demanded bribes. Cicero's speeches against Verres, a corrupt governor of Sicily, paint a vivid picture of how provincial populations were robbed blind, while their supposed protectors grew rich. For the elites, Rome's empire was not just about honor or service. It was about wealth, extracted at the expense of millions. Even the urban poor of Rome were trapped in this cycle of exploitation. While emperors gained popularity by providing bread and circuses, those spectacles were funded by ever-increasing taxes and conquests. The lavish building projects, from the Colosseum to aqueducts, relied heavily on slave labor, men and women captured in wars and condemned to work in brutal conditions. Rome's wealth was built quite literally on the backs of the conquered, and yet this reality was masked by propaganda that celebrated Roman greatness. Economic scandals were not confined to elites alone. Coinage was frequently debased by emperors seeking to stretch their treasuries, leading to inflation that hurt everyday citizens. Soldiers, the backbone of Rome's might, often found their loyalty purchased with promises of donatives, but those payments came from squeezing more wealth out of the empire. Every feast in the palace, every golden statue, and every festival came at the cost of ordinary lives. The image of Rome as a city of marble was made possible only because so many others lived in squalor. The dark side of its economy was not a secret. It was known and resented, but power ensured that the voices of the exploited rarely reached the Senate's marble halls. In the end, the story of Rome's wealth is inseparable from the story of its greed. Perhaps the most chilling reflection of Rome's darker side was its obsession with blood as entertainment. The amphitheater, that grand symbol of Roman culture, was not merely a stage for sport. It was a theater of death. For the Romans, cruelty was not hidden away in prisons or battlefields. It was displayed proudly, offered as spectacle to thousands who rode their approval as men. Women and animals met violent ends. Gladiatorial combat is the most famous example. Gladiators were often slaves, prisoners of war, or criminals, forced into a life where survival depended on strength, skill, and luck. The crowds adored them, cheering for their favorite fighters as if they were celebrities. But behind the glamour was relentless brutality. Training schools were closer to prisons, and death in the arena was a constant risk. To the Roman audience, this was not tragedy but catharsis, a way to see bravery, violence, and bloodshed acted out before their eyes. Yet gladiators were only part of the story. The Colosseum and other amphitheaters hosted executions designed as elaborate performances. Condemned criminals might be dressed as mythological figures and then slaughtered in reenactments of legendary tales. Lions, tigers, and bears were unleashed upon unarmed victims, tearing them apart as the crowd cheered. Naval battles were sometimes staged in flooded arenas, with hundreds of men forced to fight to the death in mock wars. These spectacles were not just entertainment, they were political tools. Emperors used games to win favor, distracting the people from hardship and corruption. Bread and circuses, as the poet Juvenal put it, were enough to keep the masses content. The cruelty was normalized, even celebrated, because it was wrapped in the grandeur of Roman identity. To be Roman was to revel in the spectacle of power, even when that power was displayed in the death of the helpless. What makes this darker still is how deeply ingrained it was in Roman culture. These games continued for centuries, evolving in scale and complexity, until the very idea of mass slaughter as entertainment seemed natural. Unlike today, where cruelty is condemned, for Rome it was a public virtue, a way to display dominance over man, beast, and nature itself. The amphitheater stood as both a monument to engineering brilliance and a chilling reminder that Rome's greatness was inseparable from its appetite for blood. Rome is remembered as a beacon of civilization. Its laws, its roads, its architecture still echo in our world today. But the scandals of Rome tell a different story, one where corruption, madness, lust, greed, and cruelty stood side by side with brilliance. These were not just isolated incidents. They were part of the very system, cracks in the marble that reveal the foundations beneath. Rome's darker side forces us to ask, was its greatness possible without its scandals? Or were those very scandals the price of its glory? If this journey into the scandals of ancient Rome has opened your eyes to the empire's darker side, make sure to like this video, subscribe to Empire Remembered, and hit the notification bell so you never miss another dive into the past. And tell me in the comments, if you could witness one Roman scandal firsthand, which would it be?